This section of the Canterbury Tales starts off with the host congratulating Chaucer on his great tale of Melibœus and Prudent. He goes on to state that his wife would never have been as patient as the wife mentioned in the story. He also says that his wife would have just given him a knife and told him to go murder everyone, including their dogs, and to take his best revenge as possible. He also mentions that he's quite good with a knife. After the host turns towards the monk and asks if he can tell everyone a story, he goes on to compliment the monk, saying that monks are the greatest people because they can stay away from temptations and from the fairer sex. The monk agrees that he's going to tell the next tale. He says that his are going to be more of tragedies, though about people who started off as great, at great heights, and then ended up in misery. He also goes on to explain that he's going to talk about various many characters, and it could be either in hexameter or verse or prose. He's not sure. It'll just be kind of a mixed bag. He also says that if he gets a few details wrong or shortens the story, don't hold it against him. He's just trying to go through so many. The monk starts off his story with giving a small warning about the people he is about to talk about, how he's going to relate their tragedies. The first entity he talks about is Lucifer and the great fall from heaven. The next one is very short. It's about Adam and his fall by eating the forbidden fruit and being cast out of the Garden of Eden. The third person he mentions is from the Bible, which is Samson. He goes on to a brief synopsis of the story about how he was a great ruler, a great judge, and how he was very well versed in fighting, how he was ordained or given from God the strength and all of his mighty power, and that power lived within his hair. It goes on to say that for 20 years he was able to be a great ruler with all of this strength, but unfortunately one day he told his wife Delilah about his great power. One day when he was asleep, she cut off all of his hair, which took all of his power away. Then they blinded him and put him in a cave. After a period of time, several princesses brought him out to make him the butt of the joke. However, when he was there, he shook the pillars of the temple and the roof came crumbling down and killed everyone inside. The next figure the monk talks about is Heracles, or Hercules. He recounts all of the wonderful things that Hercules, killing the centaur, slaying the lion, holding the world on his shoulders, fighting giants, every great deed he recounts. He then goes on to say that a mistress called Deianira made a shirt for him that was poisoned, and when Hercules wore it upon his back for half a day, it began to eat away the flesh and of his bones. So he takes off the shirt and puts hot coals all over his body to see if he can get rid of the poison, but unfortunately just ends up dying. The next figure we hear about is Nebuchadnezzar, how at one point he was a very glorious and righteous king who conquered Jerusalem not once, but twice. However, he let all this get to his head, where he then built an idol and that he demanded everybody worship it. When Daniel and a few others decided they were going to not worship the idol, he becomes very enraged. He then believes at one point that he is mightier than God, Nebuchadnezzar, and we learn that suddenly he begins to appear as a beast, starts to eat hay like an ox, slept outside in the rain, and wandered around with all the beasts. That is until God decided he was going to give his clarity back to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar learns of this and then begins to cry, realizing just how mighty and full of grace God is. The next one we're going to talk about is Balthazar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar. How when his father passed away, the son took over as king. The monk goes on to say that the son was even more prideful and boastful than his father, and that one day he demanded them grab the vessels full of pure wine that his father had brought from Jerusalem's temples. Him and his wife and all the concubines shared and got drunk off of this wine. He notices during this that there is handwriting on the wall, and he can't quite figure out where this hand has come from, or what it's writing. So he brings in Daniel, and Daniel tells him everything. He tells him of how with his father he was very prideful, and God took away everything from him so that he could be humbled and show just how merciful God truly is. Daniel says that he will also suffer from the same misfortune, and that the land is already divided and will soon be conquered by other people. Later, Belshazzar is murdered, and Darius takes the sovereignty. The next person that they talk about is Zenobia. The monk tells the story of her life, and that when she was a small child, she was a great and mighty warrior. She was also not afraid to tackle any wild creature and would eventually tear them limb from limb. She also made sure that she was very chaste and very pure. As she gets older, she is expected to marry off and have a husband. She really doesn't want to do this. However, she ends up marrying Odenatus, the prince, and she has 2 sons with him. The monk goes on to talk about that as they were married and they had 2 children, they became great rulers and conquered many lands. When her husband dies later on in life, she has the 2 kids make treaties with everybody to guarantee that she could just roam and explore, and that most of her fighting days were done. When the new Emperor Aurelian comes to power in Rome, he decides that he's going to capture her. He succeeds in doing this and also captures her 2 sons. That way none of them can take control of the land. The end of the story sees Zenobia and her 2 sons in chains being prisoners of war. The next person that the monk talks about is Pedro, king of Spain, and how his brother double crosses him and murders him for the kingdom. After that, the monk talks about Peter, king of Cyprus, and how at one point he was very mighty and high, but not too long after that, he is killed while sleeping. After that, we'll then talk about Bernardo of Lombardy, and how his son-in-law and nephew cast him into prison and kill him. After that, the monk talks about Ugliano, the Count of Pisa. He recounts this tragedy and how through a false lie, him and his 3 children were cast into the tower for punishment. They were starved to death and each of the 3 children passes away, and this Earl, Ugliano, was forced to eat his children. Before he goes any further into detail, he basically says, listen, if you want to know more, go read Dante, go read Dante's Inferno, you'll get the full story. The next person the monk talks about is Emperor Nero. He goes on to describe all of the horrible atrocities that Nero did in his life, from killing his brother to his sisters to even cutting open his mother's stomach just so he could see where he was born. He also describes how he killed his teacher, commanding that he shall slit his own wrists. Then one day fortune decides to change his fate and the townspeople revolt against him, trying to find him and kill him. The monk ends this tale by saying that Nero eventually kills himself, that way man couldn't destroy his body. The next person that the monk talks about is Holofernes. How he was a pomp and lofty king, and how just like Nebuchadnezzar, he said that he was greater than God, and that there should be no other worship to any other deities. One night, after a drunken stupor, a woman named Judith enters his tent and cuts off his head and brings it back to her city. The next person that the monk goes on to talk about is King Antiochus, about how this king was awful. His pride, his estate, how he killed so many people, that he truly hated God's people. Goes on to talk about how God gets his revenge in the way of planting worms inside of his entrails, since he was known for cutting open the entrails of others. The monk also goes on to talk about towards the end of this great king's life, he stunk horribly, and that hardly anybody could be around him due to the stench. The monk ends by saying that the king finally dies upon a hill and receives all of the wrath that he gave to others. The next great person the monk talks about is, of course, Alexander. How he practically ruled almost the entire world, but was never fully content. The monk goes on to say that he met his faithful end by being poisoned. The next person on this monk's list is Julius Caesar. How he rose up the ranks, got to become emperor, then goes on to talk about Brutus, Cassius, and how he planned the downfall of Julius Caesar, the attack on Caesar, and how they laid him dead. He gives warning to others of how fortune should never be trusted, because you never know what's going to happen next, and you always have to keep her eye on her. The last person that the monk talks about is Croesus, and how he was king of Cyrus. The monk starts off by saying that this king was going to be burned at the stake. However, the heavens opened up and it began to rain, which allowed his escape. The monk then tells about how the king had a dream that he saw a tree and rain and shine. So he goes to his daughter and tells her to please make sense of the dream that he had. She tells him that the dream means they're going to hang him and that his body will be left out in the rain. He doesn't quite believe her and goes on to attack. They end up hanging him in a tree, and his body is in fact left out in the rain. Here ends the monk's tale, or just a list of tragedies. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay lit.